Hey, what's up everybody? 8-Bit Flashback here. Today I'll be reviewing the Pandora Mini PowKiddy A19 handheld retro game console, and I will also show how to add games to this handheld as well. These handhelds have been released by multiple distributors, so the software and name of this handheld seems to vary. Here are some of the specs for this console. It features a 3.5-inch IPS screen with 640 by 480 resolution that runs at 60 frames per second. The CPU is a Cortex A7 running at 1.3 GHz. The RAM memory is 512 megabytes, and the system memory is 32 gigabytes. This also has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connectivity and a 4000 mAh battery. Okay, let's go ahead and power this up, and the power button is located on the left side right here, and it takes about 30 seconds or so for it to boot to the main menu. For the button layout, it has a directional pad that seems to work fairly well, and a mini joystick that works just as good. However, these two controls seem to be programmed the same, so it just becomes a preference of what control feels better to use for each game. It also has 6 action buttons, and the button layout is a little bit funky, but you can change the layout for each game if you want to. On the bottom, there's 3 more buttons. We have the Home, Select, and Start button, along with the speaker. Then on the right side will be the volume control. And on the back, there's not much happening, but on the top, we have a couple different connections. There is a HDMI out port, so you can hook up to your TV, a headphone jack, a micro SD card slot, and a charging port. And this does include a 32 gigabyte micro SD card. So there is a bunch of stuff that's already loaded on this micro SD card, and I'm going to quickly scroll through some of the different emulators with some of the different games. So it's got a bunch of older arcade games, and here are some PSP games, and this actually does a decent job with PSP emulation, although some of the more demanding 3D games do suffer a little slowdown. And same thing goes for PlayStation. The majority of the games play fairly well. Here's some Nintendo 64 games, and the emulation for Nintendo 64 is not all that great, but there is a few games that do play okay, and I'll show some testing for that later on in the video. The emulation for a lot of the 8-bit and 16-bit consoles, such as Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and PC Engine, I would say performs good on this console, and surprisingly, the Game Boy Advance emulation does a good job as well. As far as the Dreamcast emulation goes, I would say it's not very good, but again, there is a few games that do play okay. For the arcade emulation, I would say overall, this handheld does a pretty good job with a lot of the 90s and older arcade games. So let's go ahead and try an arcade game out. This is Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. So from what I can tell here, the game seems to be running at full speed, and I don't see any problems with the gameplay. The speaker on this handheld actually sounds pretty good. However, if you have the volume turned up too much, there might be a little bit of distortion. So for this game, I did turn it down just a little bit. Now, one thing I would like to mention about the action buttons, such as the A, B, C, etc. buttons, they all seem to work really well, but they are a little bit loud. I didn't really notice it so much when playing the game, but now that I'm watching the footage, they are kind of clicky sounding, so that might be an issue for some people out there. And same thing with this game, the emulation is doing well. Now, there's really no emulator options that you can play with, such as displaying the frames per second. Really, the only thing you can do is push the home button, and you can either continue the game, exit the game, save a game, or load a game. And something I would like to mention about the save game feature is it doesn't always work. Sometimes it does, and then sometimes it just doesn't work. Okay, now it's time to add some games to this handheld, and I'm going to show you 2 different methods. The first one is making sure this handheld is connected to the internet, and then you can enter the game market where you can download games, which I'm sure is on the up and up, but I wouldn't make any bets. To enter the game market, it's easy. Just push the home button, then select Enter Game Market, and that'll bring up this menu here where you have different categories and different emulator icons that you can pick from to download games. Here's some Dreamcast games, and this is not the complete collection, but there is a nice variety to pick from. And here is some Nintendo 64 games. And one thing I would like to mention with the downloads is they are kind of slow, so if you're trying to pick something big like a Dreamcast game, that might take quite a while to download. Games like Nintendo 64, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, those all download with pretty reasonable times. So right here, I've selected a homebrew Nintendo game to download. This is Angry Birds 2, and because it's just a Nintendo game, it just takes a few seconds to download. So this game is now installed. Now if I just push the D button repeatedly till I get back to the main menu, I can go to the categories and select the Famicom or Nintendo emulator, and I'll see the game that I just installed, which is Angry Birds 2. And as you can see here, the game is working. Now I will show you the second method for adding games, which will be adding games manually to the micro SD card. So to start off with, it's time to power down the handheld first. With mine, I hold the power button on the side, then select A, then wait for this green light to turn off. Now I can take the micro SD card out, and just to let you know, all the games for this handheld are stored on this micro SD card. So you want to be very careful not to reformat this card, because this will erase all the games that are already on this handheld. Now it's time to plug this micro SD card into my computer, and for that I'll be using a micro SD card adapter, but you could also use a USB reader as well. So I'm inserting this micro SD card into my computer, then using File Explorer to pull up the contents of the SD card. Located in the root of my micro SD card is two different folders. There's a Games folder and a Lost directory. I'll click on the Games folder, then click on the Download folder, and this is where the games will be stored. So inside this Download folder, you can just drag and drop compatible games however you choose, but I would suggest making folders to organize the games you add. So what I've done here is I've right-clicked, then selected New Folder, and named this folder DC for Dreamcast games. Now I'm going to select another folder, and this will be for Mame games, and another one for NES games, and one for Nintendo 64 games. Now it's time to start dragging and dropping games that I have stored on my computer into these folders I just made. So this is Mega Man 6 for the original Nintendo, and you want to make sure for most of the games that they're in an unzipped format. So this Mega Man game that I just added to the NES folder is unzipped and in a .NES format. Now it's time to add a Nintendo 64 game, and once again it needs to be unzipped, and this game is in a .N64 format. I'll drop that in the N64 folder. Now I'm going to add a Mame arcade game. This is Junior Pac-Man, and for the arcade games it is okay to have those in a zipped archive format. So I have Junior Pac-Man here located on my computer, and I'm dragging that over to the Mame folder located on the micro SD card. And finally, I'll add a couple of Dreamcast games. I'll add Mortal Kombat Gold and Sonic Adventure 2. And both of these games are unzipped and in a .CDI format. Now as far as adding thumbnails or video previews for each game, I have not figured out a method that works yet, but if I do, I'll make sure to keep you updated. And if anyone out there does know how to make some artwork work with the games, please leave a comment down below. And just for your information, with a lot of the games that you download from the game market, most of those will contain a video preview, but not all of them. So at this point, I'm done adding games to my micro SD card, so I'm going to right click, then select Eject on this micro SD card. Now it's time to pop this back into the handheld and power it back up. And unfortunately, there's still a few more steps involved to make the game show up. So now what I need to do is push the home button, then go down to Enter Game Settings, then down to External Games Management. And this will pull up all the folders I just created on the micro SD card. From here, I'll select the Dreamcast folder, then the first Dreamcast game. Now it's time to choose an emulator that I want this game to work with. So this is a Dreamcast game, so I'm going to be searching for the DC emulator. And once I find that emulator, I select that. Then I do the same thing for the second game. So after choosing the correct emulator, it will edit the games list, and these games will now be viewable from the main menu. And as you can see here, it adds a console icon as well. Now it's time to hit that back button, which is the D button, then select the next folder, which will be Mame, then select the appropriate emulator. For this one, it will be Mame 37. Now we'll go to the next folder, then select the appropriate emulator for this game, which will be N64, then down to NES, and I will select the FC emulator for Famicom or Nintendo games. I now have all the games added, so I can hit that D button repeatedly until I get back to the home screen. And if I go to categories, all my games should now be visible. Here is the Dreamcast section, and I will test these games here in just a few. Let's move over to the next category. Here is Mame. Junior Pac-Man is visible right there. And here is Star Wars Shadow of the Empire, the game I added for Nintendo 64. And there is Mega Man for NES. And let's go ahead and play this game for just a few. So the game seems to be playing at full speed. The sound sounds good. I do notice a little bit of screen tearing once in a while, but it's not bad. Okay, now let's try Star Wars out, the game I added for Nintendo 64. So this is Shadows of the Empire. And the game started to load just fine, and then it just went to a black screen. So unfortunately, this seems to be a game that's not compatible with this emulator, but I will try a few more Nintendo 64 games out here in just a bit. And here is Junior Pac-Man for Mame Arcade. And it seems to be playing really well. And I do prefer to use the mini joystick with this game. So Ms. Pac-Man has always been my favorite out of the older Pac-Mans, but Junior Pac-Man is a close second. Now let's try out those Dreamcast games I added. We'll start off with Mortal Kombat Gold. Ah, the sound of the Dreamcast intro, one of my favorites. So this game started off really bad. As you can see, it's really choppy and the sound's all messed up. But once you get to the main menu, it sounds much better and the game seems to be playable. So from what I can tell, this game seems to play pretty close to full speed most of the time. Occasionally I do notice some choppiness from a little bit of slowdown and some sound issues as well, but overall, I would say this game is playable. Now, one thing I did find really awkward when playing this game is that the button layout was mixed up. The high punches and low punches and high kicks and low kicks were mixed up, so it made it really confusing while playing. But luckily I can change the button layout for this game by going into the settings, which I'm gonna have to do. Okay, let's test out the next Dreamcast game. This is Sonic Adventure 2. And as you can hear here, it's not doing very well. And I also have no analog control. So this game is a no-go. Here is Marvel vs. Capcom 2 for the Dreamcast, and this game is doing really well. And as I mentioned earlier, there's no frames per second counter, so I can display how fast this game is running, but from what I can tell while playing, it seems to be at full speed. Now let's try out some Nintendo 64 games. And I did test a couple games already that I can't display for certain reasons. Mario Kart 64, Super Mario 64, and F-Zero, I would say are all playable on this handheld. I did try GoldenEye, and it did not do very good. As far as Cruis'n World goes, I would say it's playable, but a little choppy, and I'll show you some gameplay right now. So this emulator seems to have some sort of frame skip enabled to make this game appear it's running at full speed. But when steering the vehicle, it becomes really touchy, and it becomes noticeable that it's not running at full speed, with the correct frames per second. So I would consider this game barely playable, but you're probably not going to have that much fun playing it. Here is Tony Hawk for the Nintendo 64, and I seem to have some control issues. I can't do any jumps of any sort. And after playing this for a while, it actually just locked up and went to a black screen. So I'd say this game is not compatible. Here is Wipeout. And this game also did not have very good performance. It was very slow and choppy. And here is San Francisco Rush for the Nintendo 64. And this game's actually playing alright. And I would say it's playing it pretty close to full speed. And I'm enjoying playing this. So overall, I think this handheld is great for retro games. It can play a mixture of 2D and 3D games. Its strong points would be the 80s and 90s arcade games, but it's also capable of emulating many home consoles from these eras as well. The form factor of this handheld is nice, and feels similar to a Game Boy Color when holding. One thing I wish this handheld did have is some trigger buttons on the back for better game compatibility. The screen looks great from all angles due to the IPS panel. If I had to give this a rating from 1 out of 10, with 10 being the best, I would probably say 7.5. Okay, it's time for me to go. If you liked this video, if you could, hit that like button, and have yourself a great day, and I'll see you next time.